All right, rambly time. Somebody asked me to talk about the topic of truth, which is not exactly a trivial matter. It's a topic that you can talk about for hours and days and years and centuries. And people have. Throughout human history, that has been debated a lot. And of course, it has many facets. I'm just going to pick out only very few isolated thoughts that I've had throughout the years. But it's not going to be anything groundbreaking. At least I don't think so. Maybe you disagree. I don't know. We'll see. But in science, of course, you have pretty clear, rigid guidelines for how to conduct research, how to, conduct a proper experiment, how to isolate the different variables, how to formulate a hypothesis, how to test it, how to build up a theory based on the evidence that you have. And by the way, that's a thing that people commonly get wrong. Often when people hear theory, they think about the colloquial term theory. And colloquially, in everyday life, people just use the term theory as kind of assumption. And in science, it's far more than that. It's built upon a lot of evidence. Like gravity, for instance, whenever people say, oh, evolution is just a theory, well, so is gravity. You want to dispute that. And gravity is actually a good example. I mean, you could say that we have a pretty good understanding of it, and our model, our theoretical model of gravity, can be tested, and that's a big thing, of course. If you can test something, if different people can test it, and you come up with consistent results, yeah, you can let an object drop 1,000,000 times, and it's going to fall downwards for the most part. I mean, quantum theory goes, in dark places, so to speak, and says that, well, eventually, if you drop something often enough, eventually it might freeze in midair or whatever. There is this, very, very unlikely, but still theoretically probable chance that something crazy happens. But for the most part, it's testable, and we have a pretty good idea about it. However, if, say, there was a different species from a different planet, and they also had a theory of gravity, they might not frame it the same way. They may still be observing the same phenomenon, but they may, conceptualize it in a different way. So they may explain it in ways that may be kind of confusing to us. However, they might still be able to get the same results. And, with physics, for example, the basics of physics, of course, is absolute. You're observing, absolute laws of nature. And by the way, laws, that's another thing that people often get wrong colloquially. Laws of nature, it doesn't mean law in the sense of something that is ought to be. It's just what is. That's really all it means. It's not like, oh, this should be this way. No, that's what it is. That's how it's like. But if they had a different way of, thinking about it, different language, and language, again, is a big thing. It can influence quite a lot our knowledge and what we can conceive of. So it would be possible to imagine gravity in a different way, but still come up with the same calculations, say, still come up with something like, whatever, let's say a rocket. Yeah. And that's one of those things where we can be reasonably certain of scientific knowledge when you can make it work. Like, for example, mathematics, you can, reasonably prove that, well, it does work. Things like, well, a computer is a good example of, well, this scientific knowledge works. And that's really what matters at the end of the day. It's not necessarily so much how you present it, how you think about it, but what you can do with it, at least from my pragmatic point of view, I suppose. So in that case, if you can do something with it and it works, if you can, build a product or whatever, if you can test it in whatever way, or create something that has practical use, then that's a pretty good indication that you're onto something. With more abstract ideas, it gets more problematic, and especially things like morality. Whenever I hear people talk about absolute truth in that regard, it's very, very difficult. Relativism is a pretty important concept in philosophy, and also in cultural anthropology and a lot of fields, which means that something that is true for us, a particular cultural group, like for example, if you say it is wrong to eat the dead, or whatever, it is wrong to have sex with siblings, say, for example. And other cultures might disagree with that. I mean, an Egyptian pharaoh would be appalled by our idea that it is wrong to procreate with your siblings because, well, that's what they did in order to keep the royal bloodline pure. So they had a completely different view. And also with eating dead relatives, in some cultural groups it was perfectly acceptable, and to them it would be morally repugnant and just appalling to just burn them or bury them in the ground. That's the kind of things where relativism comes into play. It gets very complicated when there is something where we perceive that it's bad for a group of human beings, and they disagree, and then we have to make the decisions. Do we intervene and try to, from our point of view, improve life for them, or do we leave them alone? It's when we get into really difficult issues there. But even just aside from such problems, philosophical problems, moral problems, how can we be certain about something? If you are a scientific expert in a particular field and you're really you're doing that for your living, basically, and you're really good at, well, I shouldn't say good at, but you know how to do meta-analysis, and you know how to, check a scientific study or an article to, figure out how well conducted it is, and how valid the points are. But for us regular people, if you will, about something, if you find information, especially on the internet, I mean, the internet is on the one hand, it's an amazing wealth of information. I mean, it's ginormous, all the information on there, and a lot of really deep and useful information and advice and all kinds of things, history and everything you can find on the internet. But at the same time, there's also a lot of bullshit. I mean, just random assertions made by people, and crazy conspiracy theories that can never be either proven or disproven because, well, if it doesn't seem to make sense, or if you don't think that that's true, well, that's what they want you to believe. So you get into some really crazy stuff where in a lot of cases, well, it's difficult to be certain that something is not true, but at the same time you can't really prove that it is. And in a lot of cases, even when you see something like one particular study, for example, you may think, oh, it's a scientific study, it has to be right, but if you look more closely, there are plenty of studies that are not done very well, poor methodology, or there was some kind of confirmation bias, or even well-conducted experiments, proper studies sometimes are contradicted by later studies that try to do the same, but they cannot replicate the results. That doesn't necessarily mean that the other study was bad. It just means that, well, they found something that is not replicable, so it's not necessarily right, for whatever reason. There are many cases in which you can come up with incorrect results, which doesn't even have to be your own fault. And so in that case, if you read about something like first thing that comes to my mind, well, I've talked about the video game thing. Let's say e-cigs, vaping, if you've ever heard of that. Electronic cigarettes that basically don't work by burning tobacco, but work by evaporating nicotine and flavoring containing liquids, to sum it up quickly. And you get a lot of people who say that, well, there's nothing wrong with that, there's no harmful effect of that whatsoever. Obviously, cigarettes, well, have negative health effects. I think at this point we can all agree on that. About that, you'll find some people who say that, well, it's still bad because you're still drawing vapor together with nicotine and flavoring and various chemicals through your lungs, and that's bad. It obviously can't be good. It's not as good as just breathing clean air. And others say, nope, there's nothing wrong with that. Also with nicotine, there are studies that presumably show negative effects of nicotine. Others don't find any. For example, there was one where they tested it on rats, made them breathe just nicotine in the air, nothing else, and checked for any signs of cancer, but didn't find anything. Although the rats in that group did lose some weight, whatever. And same with weed, say. A lot of potheads out there are trying to basically make it appear as the wonder cure. That's awesome stuff for you, does nothing but good for you. I'm sorry if I appear a little critical here, but then there's also the other side that say, well, you're still drawing smoke through your lungs, and the THC over time will cause some health damage or whatever. So you really have to spend a lot of time reading up on that. You can't just go on Wikipedia and go, oh, okay, it says this, well, must be true. It's not that simple, of course. If you really want to know, then you have to really dig into it. But that also means that you can't just read a couple of studies and be done with it, a couple of articles. You also have to check how reliable are those sources. You have to check you have to check for reviews, meta-analysis of these articles to figure out, are they even any good? And for a lay person, that's not easy. For an expert in that field, that's not a hard thing to do. But for the average person, it requires a lot of prior knowledge that they may not have, and also it requires a lot of time and dedication, basically. So in most cases, for practical purposes in everyday life, we just can't do that. We basically we have our confirmation bias, of course, and we basically just make snap judgments, and we look at something, a statement, and, well, that makes sense, or I guess that's true, whatever, and then you just move on, right? You just can't spend hours upon hours every day checking and counter-checking every single source, and where does that come from? Oh, where does that come from? And because you can follow the chain quite a bit. However, some basic skepticism, of course, is good. If you just see some, a blog or whatever, an article online, and it quotes no sources at all, it's just text, yeah, you have to take that with at least a pound of salt, basically. It's most likely just going to be someone's opinion, and problematic. So in a lot of cases, even if you think you know something, you might not, or what you think you may know is possibly misinformation or misinterpretation or whatever. And when we get to more metaphysical stuff, it gets even worse, of course. Spiritual beliefs and such. You just can't know for sure. The thing is, even if you have something like a near-death experience or something, you still can't know if that's real because, well, there is such a thing as hallucinations. Like if everybody just took their experiences and their subjective perception as 100% reality, that would be catastrophic, pretty much, because then everybody, every schizophrenic person and everybody on drugs would just have all kinds of crazy stuff that, well, this is reality, all those colors and whatnot. So it's not that simple. You can't even trust your own senses, because sometimes our senses don't work that well, and sometimes our brains don't work that well either. For example, the reliability of eyewitnesses and testimonials have been questioned a lot, to say the least, because studies have proven that people don't remember as clearly as they think they do. Sometimes a person says, well, I remember with 100% clarity, this is the person, that's who did it. And then I figured out, no, that's not true. You have incorrect memories. Sometimes the brain does adjust memory based on later input. Yeah, you can actually, by means of suggestion and even just certain suggestive questions, you can actually mislead somebody into, quote unquote, remembering something that never even happened. So there's a lot of room for error. So, well, the world is freaking confusing. That's really it. It's very difficult to know much for certain. And I've also found that the more ignorant somebody is, the more they think they know everything. It's interesting. I guess it also relates to the famous statement by Socrates, I know that I know nothing. Usually the wiser a person is, the more they realize how little they know. Also, as you progress in your studies about pretty much anything, the more you learn, the more you realize how vast your gaps are. I'm sure a lot of you know that phenomenon very well. And I've by the way, I've had that a lot myself when it comes to, swords and martial arts and stuff. Sometimes when I look back at some of the stuff I said some years ago, or that I thought, and I just go, oh, this is embarrassing. I look back at my older self, and I just go, oh, what an ignorant, smart-ass piece of shit. That kind of thing. You think, oh, I understand this. I figured this out. No, you know nothing. You know nothing, Jon Snow. It's pretty amazing. And the more you learn, the more you realize that, like, oh, well. And that's also why it's so important to work together. Like, even in the HEMA community or in the scientific community, everywhere, you can learn a lot from other people, because other people have a different perspective. And what's this this fable again, or story? I think it's from I think it's a Hindu analogy, where you have like a blind man and a deaf man, and a couple of people with some kind of limited perception in some way. And they all, or was it a couple of blind? I'm sorry, I don't quite remember. But basically, there's an elephant, and they are trying to figure out what is this thing. And one just gropes at the tail, and one gropes at the trunk, and they try to, they come up with explanations of what it is based on that one piece. So all of them are technically correct, but they don't get the whole picture. None of them gets the elephant. They all just get some pieces, but if they all work together and all shared their experiences, their, subjective part, their subjective perception, their little niche of reality, if you will, or niche, whatever. If they all pooled that together, they might get a lot better understanding of what this thing is. Yeah, I think I'm running out of steam now. It's a lot of stuff, lots of rambliness. I don't even know if anybody has made it this far. If you have, then Your attention span is quite impressive. I always say that with these long, rambly videos, don't I? Oh well, I guess that's a thing. Anyway, so if you have made it this far, thanks for watching, and yeah, hopefully this stimulated some thought processes in your gray matter. All right then, see you guys.